to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. Okay, so thank you very much for everyone for joining the ISIE SEM Perpetual online conference. So this is 12th session since 2020. As you know, we have the very weird situation under the COVID-19, and I hope everybody being safe. And I saw so many names which is very well known, and we are very looking forward to having lots of interesting sessions here. And also we as a SEM board, that we are trying to find how to keep our communications in the SEM during the last 2 years. So we really welcome all of you joining here and via Zoom and also YouTube later. And as Stefan saying, we post a video on YouTube later, and maybe the different time zone person will be check this YouTube and also check this session as well. And one more thing that I need to announce is we will have the physical conference of the ISIE SEM in Vienna very, very soon. That is 19th to 21st of September this year. So we are very looking forward to seeing you, all of you in face, I think, in person. So and of course, I hope you to check the ISIE SEM website for more information. And very welcome to be a member of the SEM as well. So we are looking forward to joining you as one of the SEM members and keep discussion in the SEM. And today, thanks to Stefan Parik, we have a very interesting session that names Scenarios for the Raw Material Demand and Material Caps. And I hope you to enjoy all of you about this session. So back to Stefan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hiroki Tanikawa, the chair of our Social Economic Metabolism section. We will now start with our presentation. The first presenter of our session is Takuma Watari from the National Institute of Environmental Studies in Japan. Takuma is already very well known in the field because you have published a few quite important and seminal papers on the carbon footprint of metal production and on the future scenario development. And you're here with us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, on presenting about bulk material cycles at the national level in a zero emissions future. So with that, Takuma, I would like to hand it over to you. Please share your screen.
Okay.
And I'll keep the time. You have about 15 minutes for the talk, and then we have 5 minutes for clarification questions, please.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me. I assume you can see my screen clearly. Okay, all right. So yeah, my talk today is about the bulk material cycle at the national level, especially in the context of the transition to a zero carbon future. Okay, so I'm just trying to erase the pointer. Right, so this figure shows the greenhouse gas emissions from the global material production over the past 20 years, where we can see, material-related emissions have more than doubled during this time period. And importantly, the contribution of materials production to overall emissions has increased, over the years, with now material production accounting for about a quarter of total emissions. And when looking at the breakdown of materials, we see steel and cement are the largest emitters, which contributes more than half of materials-related emissions. So clearly, climate change mitigation is largely dependent on the deep decarbonization of these, two high-emitting materials production sector. So our research group is tackling the challenge of how to decarbonize these two high-emitting sectors, and that's what my presentation is about today. So let me start with cement and the concrete that uses cement as a binding agent. Okay, so the content is based on our recent work published in Nature Communications, which is the collaboration work with the ZKAO from the University of Antwerp. I think he's attending this seminar as well. But so if you are interested, you can dig deeper into the details in the paper. So I will skip the details of the methodology, but basically what we have tried to do here is to build a system model that describes cement and the concrete cycle as a series of mass balancing equations. So the model first quantifies the flow and stock of concrete based on construction activities and structure-specific material intensity data, and then relates them to other material and resource use such as cement, clinker, aggregates, and water. And so the CO2 emissions are quantified based on a comprehensive data set documenting energy consumption and emission factors used in each process, which are basically based on the government managed data. And we also integrated a physicochemical model to account for the CO2 uptake associated with the concrete carbonation. So the model is available on the GitHub, so you can get the Python code from the link here, and you can also get all the input data needed to run the model from there. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the main findings. So what we can see here is the Japanese cement and the concrete cycle and associated CO2 fluxes in 2019, which offers some insights into intervention opportunities for emission mitigation. Okay, so for example, the clinker to cement ratio in Japan is 83%, which is slightly higher than other regions such as Europe and the United States. And approximately 2% of concrete was lost as construction waste, which represents concrete that was produced but never included in a final product. We can also see most demolished concrete is downcycled as load-based materials and landfilled or turned into hibernating stock. So there's almost invisible recycling flow to concrete aggregates. When looking at the CO2 fluxes, we see more than 80% of the CO2 emissions are attributed to cement production, which is kind of obvious, but CO2 uptake from concrete carbonation reaches about a quarter of emissions. But you can see net emissions are still far from zero. Okay, and when looking at the demand side drivers of cement and the concrete cycle through the input-output table, endogenizing fixed capital formation, we can say housing is the primary driver, as many might imagine, but demand for services such as like healthcare, education, retail, and transportation are also a very important driver, as you can see here. So this trend reflects the capital-intensive nature of services, like education requires schools, medical and healthcare requires hospitals and nursing homes, and retail services require like retail facilities. So the opportunity to effectively intervene in the cement and the concrete flows from the demand side is not only in housing, but in a variety of goods and services, including like healthcare, education, and retail. And when looking at the concrete stock accumulated in the society in the form of buildings and infrastructure, we see in-use concrete stock continue to increase throughout the 20th century, as you can see here. But its growth has stabilized since the beginning of the 21st century, and we can see it generally remained constant for about like last 10 years. And I think this is quite important observation because, as shown in the bottom figure here, this trend reflects that the building and the infrastructure that are required to maintain Japan's current living standards have already been sufficiently established. So, if we do not assume any changes in our lifestyles or like urban structure, we can make pretty good guess as to how the concrete stock will evolve into the future, and how much concrete will need to be produced to form that stock. So this is the CO2 fluxes to 2050 based on future cement and the concrete stocks and flows calculated with such logic. And what we can see is if no action is taken, the trends of CO2 emissions and the uptake do not change significantly over the next decades, resulting in net emission balance of like 20 million metric tons of CO2 in 2050. Which is almost equal to about 2% of Japan's current total CO2 emissions. So, the key question is, what needs to be done to achieve zero emission and zero emission cement on the concrete cycle. So we modeled the low of 16 strategies in total, which can be broadly classified into 3 categories. So the first category is the supply side, conventional supply side strategies, which are envisioned to enhance current efforts by industries to reduce emissions through, such as improving energy efficiency, using low carbon fuels, and reducing clinker to cement ratios. The second category is emerging supply side strategies, which include low carbon cement chemistries and carbon capture and utilization. These are innovative measures, but take some time to scale up. The last category is demand side strategies, which refers to the demand side intervention by the systems and actors that uses concrete in the built environment, such as material efficiency strategy, material efficient design, the lifetime extension, buildings and infrastructure, and so forth. So the basic kind of storyline is whether it is technically possible to achieve net zero emissions across the cement and the concrete cycle without relying on the CCS, carbon capture and storage, because it belongs to the lowest hierarchy of strategies, and it has various negative impacts and trade-offs. Okay, so we will now look at how much emissions can be saved by each of these strategies. So what we can see here is that the conventional supply side measures can reduce the emissions by almost half compared to the no actions, but emissions are still far from net zero emissions, as you can see here. So we have a mitigation gap. And further emissions savings can be achieved by more emerging strategies that are currently under active development in the cement and the concrete industry. But what we can see here is, even if all of these supply side measures are implemented, the collective mitigation potential is only about 80%, which is 20% short of achieving net zero emissions. But the remaining 20% mitigation gap can be filled by demand side material efficiency strategies. So one of the key conclusions here is it is technically possible to achieve net zero emissions across the cement and the concrete cycle by 2050 without relying on massive deployment of CCS, if all the supply and demand side strategies, spanning the entire value chain, are implemented quickly and ambitiously. So, given the demand side driver we just saw, how we kind of build and buy and use our homes, and as well as hospitals, schools, and roads, and retail facilities is crucial to decarbonizing the sector, the cement and the concrete sector. It's not just about the industry job. So here we have figures showing the CO2 fluxes for 3 representative scenarios. And what is important here is we are looking at the CO2 fluxes at the system level, not at the product level. So the net zero emission, it refers to a state in which emissions associated with production activities are balanced by system-wide uptake and storage, mainly from in use stock and demolition waste brought about by past cement and the concrete production, as you can see here. So we also did a kind of sensitivity analysis to better understand how demand side measures can reduce reliance on CCS. So what we can see from here is, without implementing demand side strategies, 70% of the kiln capacity will need to be equipped with CCS to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And this high reliance on CCS can be reduced to 30% by implementing demand side strategies at only 50% of maximum potential. And if demand side strategies could be implemented at the level of 80% of maximum potential, then the reliance on CCS in achieving 2050 net zero could be eliminated. But what I want to highlight here is not to deny the need for investment in CCS, but rather the kind of like options required to decarbonize the sector should include far more strategic options, not just single silver bullet supply side technology. Okay, so here's a summary of the implications from these results. So this paper is open access, so you can read it for free if you are interested. Okay, so let's move on to study of the steel cycle briefly. So what we have tried to identify here is not kind of what can be done in each process, but kind of which, how, and to what extent the flow of steel should be changed in order to align the steel flows to zero emissions future. By doing this, we kind of try to identify what scale of adaptation measures will be required in what demand sectors. So this is like still ongoing work, so results are just authentic ones. But the approach to understanding the current steel flow is essentially the same as it was for cement and concrete. But we are using richer data of steel to build a more detailed intermediate and final product flow. And here's the results. So this Sankey diagram shows the flow of steel in Japan in 2019 from the supply of raw materials to iron making, steel making, goods manufacturing, and the input of goods into the society, inflow. The color of each flow reflects the share of steel made from scrap-based electric arc furnace lead. And what we can see here is a downcycling practice of the scrap steel. So as you can see, currently, the ore-based blast furnace routes accounts for about 75% of total crude steel production, and the scrap-based electric arc furnace routes accounts for about the remaining 25%. But about 90% of the scrap-based carbon steel is processed into long products, such as sections and bars, used mainly in buildings and infrastructure. So scrap-based steels account for less than 10% of total production of high-grade steel, such as sheet steel and high tensile strength steel, which are often used in the automotive industry. And so the building and the infrastructure industry obtain more than half of their total steel requirements through the scrap-based production routes, but the automotive industry relies more heavily on ore-based carbon-intensive steel, as you can see this flow. So the question is, if this current steel structure is maintained going forward, what quantity and quality of steel can be produced under the sectoral carbon budget? So this question was addressed by a model called material budget model that combines optimization routines and a set of mass balancing equations. So the model estimates a material flow structure consistent with the carbon budget under a variety of technological assumptions by treating material flows as endogenous variables in the optimization routine. This is kind of an opposite idea of integrated astronomical model. So the sectoral carbon budget is based on a national target of a 46% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. The basic concepts are described in several papers we have recently published shown here. Okay, so these are the tentative results we have obtained so far. So we have crude steel production, finished steel production, and end-use goods production from top to the bottom. Okay, so looking first at the crude steel production, we can see even under optimistic assumptions about production technology and the circular economy, the production available under the sectoral carbon budget could be limited to about 35% of current levels by 2050. And this is quite important because industry currently has high hopes for hydrogen-based steel-making technology. So we have considered the uptake of this process as shown in the light blue, but this process is very electricity intensive, and we have limited electricity available to the industry. So it may be challenging for just this production process to have all of its current steel production capacity by 2050, 28 years from now. So accordingly, the production of finished steel will decline, but the important point here is if current downcycling practices continue, the production of flat products will be more severely limited than long products, as you can see, because of the shrinking capacity of ore-based production routes. And consequently, the automotive industry, a major user of high-grade steel, could face more severe steel supply constraints than the building and infrastructure industry at roughly 30% of what it is today by 2050. And turning to the steel stock, I mean, the steel accumulated in society as building a product and infrastructure, we see in-use steel stock could gradually decline over 2050 from about 10 tons per person today to about like 7 tons per person if no action is taken. And under optimistic assumptions about production technology and the circular economy, the total stock could rise to 9 tons per person. So the total amount of stock could potentially remain almost the same as today. But if we look closer at stock levels by end users, as you can see here, we see buildings and infrastructure could maintain similar levels to the current levels, but steel stock per person in automotive applications could drop to like 40 to 80% of current levels by 2050, which means our demands for goods and services, especially those related to automotive sector, may need to be met with less steel use than at present in a zero emission future. So looking at the final demand drivers of current steel flows with the importance of automotive sector in mind, we can see transport demand in households and the government actually explains only about half of automotive related steel flows. So the other half is actually attributed to various goods and services, such as retail and housing, food, and healthcare, which reflects the essential nature of automotive sector in the provision of goods and services, such as transport of products from one factory to another. So from a demand side perspective, how automotive applications are owned and used by like households and the government will contribute only about half of the total automotive related steel flows, and the other half will be determined by the automotive applications used in the provision of goods and services. So, we can say the key is to promote efficient use of cars, trucks, and so forth in the entire supply chain of goods and services, not just in households and perhaps in the government. Okay, so here's a summary. Today's talk was only about cement and concrete, but I will soon be working on plastic and wood products as well. So I hope I can collaborate with you in those areas in the near future, hopefully. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I look forward to taking questions and having discussions.
Thank you so much, Takuma. This was a wonderful presentation and really showing a high level, both for steel and cement. A quick reminder to everybody who signed up later, we're recording this session to be later distributed on the ISIE's YouTube channel, but we will stop the recording for the discussion. So if you're comfortable appearing on the YouTube, you can have time, we have time for clarification questions now, then we will move on and we have a general discussion in the end. So please, any questions? I'll start with Stain from the chat. Great studies, nice figures. He's asking, Takuma, when you can clarify to what extent your material efficiency strategies for cement lead to an increase of alternative materials. I don't know.
Actually, that's a great question. So alternative materials, we didn't actually model the wood substitution of engineered wood for concrete, but we consider the clinker to cement ratio reduction by using industrial byproducts like blast furnace slag, and we didn't model the fly ash, but we did a kind of these industrial byproducts. So in implementing these strategies, we see some increase in these industrial byproducts utilization in the cement and the concrete cycle, but not the wood product or something.
Thank you. So no large-scale substitution yet, but byproducts. And I think the details can be found in your publication, right? Because the cement work is already out. So then we'll take Helmut, then from the chat, who is in the chat, Kimon, and then we'll move on. And we have time later, of course. Helmut, please.
Yeah, many thanks. I think it's great work. I have a question. I mean, if you have these different greenhouse gas reduction or mitigation options, they will influence each other, kind of. So, for example, if you reduce demand, then the potential to reduce emissions in supply also is reduced. How did you take into account these systemic interactions between the different options in this model?
Oh yeah, actually that's a very good question, and this is actually the area we are struggling with still. So like, if we reduce the demand, there's less incentive in reducing the emissions per unit of production in the industry, right? So we suddenly lose the incentive to implement the CCS in the industry if we have decreased demand. So yeah, I mean that's a kind of quite difficult question. I didn't really address that challenges in the publication. So actually, I don't have any good ideas, but we have considered the kind of trade-offs of each kind of demand side strategies based on the kind of mass balancing constraints. So what we did consider was just the physical kind of mass balancing constraints, not like these trade-offs that you and I just discussed.
I think this is an important question. It will reappear in the other presentations as well to take up in the general discussions then, right? Thank you. And then lastly, so Karina, your question, I'm sorry, we will take later. I'll continue with Kimon and then we need to move on, but please do remember your questions, Karina. We'll take it up in the general discussion. So Kimon is asking, what about CCS in the steel making? What are your implementations and the plans for retrofitting existing basic oxygen furnaces and blast furnaces?
Yes. So we did consider the CCS in the blast furnace leads. So that assumption is based on the national sort of research project called the COAST 50. I forgot the exact name, but yeah, so we considered the CCS in the blast furnace lead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Karina, we'll then later move on with your question right in the general discussion. And now we move on to roughly keep the schedule. So I'll do the next presentation as kind of a substitute. Of course, we have many things to talk about, low energy materials demand. My presentation will be rather complementary to Takuma's presentation. I asked a few more colleagues. Of course, there are many more people who should speak in this session, but unfortunately, because also in the Northern Hemisphere, the summer holidays is approaching, which is a good thing, but it means they were not available. I'm sorry for the hiccup here. But please give a quick confirmation whether you can see now my PowerPoint.
Yeah, very fine.
Thank you. Too many screens and too much stuff. So I'm a professor for industrial ecology at the University of Freiburg, and one of our main work items is low energy and material demand future. I don't need so much introduction here because Takuma, you already set the stage really nicely. We want to see here in this particular presentation what's going on at the global scale. We live in the world with scarce energy and still abundant materials, at least when you look at the prices of energy at the moment and of materials. But in the future, we can expect it to be the other way around. We have a material transition going on to renewable energies. We want to harvest abundant sources of especially solar and wind energy, but we know that these need much more materials, especially specialty materials starting from copper, but also minor metals. So there is a scarcity. The same holds for urban expansion. In some world regions, we just don't have the sand that we need to build up all the cities. So there is a huge scarcity in the future. So not only for climate reasons, but also for land use, for pollution, and for material scarcity reasons, we need to rethink the way we use materials. We have a broad understanding of sustainability in our frameworks. We have an ultimate idea of human well-being. So we model the applications or the functions or the services, and we have environmental impacts. And in between, we have the third pillar, the economic pillar, that provides the product stocks, the material flows. So we have all these stages from renewable energy to material production, to operating cars or buildings, and each step here in the chain is an opportunity to decouple. So some people say they develop efficient products and they call this sustainable engineering. And this is wrong. Of course, efficient products, long-lived products, durable products are one part of the cascade, but not the whole thing. Only the whole system can be sustainable. So we need to study all these decoupling options. And of course, material flow analysis can help to link functions to resource extraction, so covering a large chunk of this cascade. So in our model, we cover this blue big box here. We focus on the function of stocks, so the driving of vehicle, the heating and the cooling of buildings, and also the stocks themselves. And we model this in form of a cascade. So we have residential building scenarios starting from current level. You see here the 4 different country groups, US very high with up to 70 square meters per person, down to maybe 12 square meters for India. There's a quick chat that's not related now, but if there's anything, please speak up if there's a technical hiccup and so on. And then we have scenarios for the future development. We have a low demand scenario you can see here in the middle, and we have shared socioeconomic pathways. These are just expert estimates of how the stock could evolve in the future. So 30 square meters per person could be a low demand scenario that can be considered a decent standard of living. And interesting here, you see an example of contraction and convergence. If you look at the differences, the current differences in building stock, 12 square meters in India and sub-Saharan Africa, 70 in the US. That's a factor of 6. In the future, the low energy demand, but also the SSP scenarios, the difference goes down to a factor of 2 and below. So there is a convergence to much more similar lifestyle and more global equality levels than we see today. It's even more drastic for non-residential buildings. 24 square meters of non-residential buildings currently in the US, schools, hospitals, restaurants, offices, and stores, but only 1 square meter in India, a factor of more than 24 we see. Also here, it's very reasonable to assume some form of global convergence to a less drastic difference and maybe to more decent levels of service provision. So we start with the stocks in our model and also the operating of stocks, right? The stocks have to be heated and cooled. So we have scenarios for this in our model. Depending on the region, of course, different climate entails different heating and cooling demand. So you can see here this cascade. We have a product stock at the bottom that has an intensity of operation, for example, for the vehicle, how much kilometer are driven, how many kilometers, and then an intensity of use, how many people are in the vehicle. This then tells you the function that is provided. The functions then generate the service, like the locomotion or the thermal comfort and so on. And from the product stocks, we can go downwards to the material cycles. Once we know the product stocks from the lifetime model, we can calculate the new products and the old products. This we link to the material cycles. And then we can calculate the split between secondary and primary production, the same that Takuma already showed, to then get the full picture of this cascade. The full picture is the operational energy, the material flows for new products, the recycling demand, but also the energy for material production. So everything is included in this comprehensive system definition. You see the material cycle. You see in the green boxes the different material efficiency strategy we can apply consistently. And that's already one answer to Helmut's question, the interaction between strategies. Once we have the stock flow consistency, you at least have the potential is consistent. For example, when you model a product lifetime extension, you also get less scrap in the end because you delay the product, throwing away the products. So this is consistently depicted, everything that really affects the material cycle. We link it to energy supply and we link it to resource consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. And we have these different material efficiency strategies in the models. The timber buildings, so large-scale material substitution. We have small-scale improvements there too. We have the shared solutions, so that's demand-side solutions, the classical lifetime extension and better recycling. So really comprehensive here. And this is the type of results that we get. I'm also looking a bit at the time. I don't want to stretch it too long. And the result here in qualitative terms is very similar to what Takuma already presented. You see here the total sectoral CO2 emissions over time globally, but not only the use phase, but also the energy supply and the material supply. So all the supply chain of buildings. On the left side, we see here the SSP2. So growth as usual, most countries more or less reach very high stock levels beyond the 50 square meters for residential and 20 square meters for non-residential buildings. And on the right side, we have the low demand scenarios converging to more like 30 square meters for residential. And I forgot, I think about 15 for non-residential. So left column, conventional demand, right column, low demand. On the top row, we have scenarios with no new climate policy. On the bottom row, we have scenarios with a decarbonized, largely decarbonized energy supply. You see greenhouse gas reductions in all scenarios because of increasing efficiency. And you see that either that's now the upper left, sorry, the upper right or the bottom left corner, orange and green, you can see quite substantial reductions for either low demand or for low carbon energy supply. But the real low carbon scenarios, the bottom right corner, the red scenarios, is when you combine both. When you combine the supply mitigation with the demand mitigation, then you go down to something close to zero. And we're now zooming into this low corner. We see here different strategies, especially using wooden buildings. And the purple line is material efficient wooden buildings with cascading. So we use the wood a second time in like strand boards or particle boards. And with the carbon sequestration of the wood, so the carbon is in the wood, not in the atmosphere, we can actually go to also climate neutrality in the building stock. We actually cross the zero line. The carbon stock, the building stock, because of the carbon sink, can be, from an attributional perspective, become a zero sector. Very idealistic technical potential, very similar to what Takuma said. So there's a lot of behavioral options that probably will lead to rebound effects, but technically it's possible. The wood supply is there in principle. It's not so much wood here included because we need to consider the supply constraints, but we could have the storage here, plus of course low demand scenarios and decarbonized energy material supply gives it a carbon neutrality. And that means on the right side, the cement consumption will drop significantly. The solid, the dark lines, dark green and dark blues are the wood intensive buildings. They lead to low cement demand globally for the sector. So roughly down to 25% to 40% of what we have today. The wood will go up, but not much beyond current supply patterns. So globally, there is a timber industry that is in principle available to supply, at least for the building sector, which is the largest application of long-lived wood products, to supply the material there, because we have a clear land scarcity here for wood. We cannot completely substitute cement, go to wooden buildings. That's simply not possible because we don't have the land to grow all the trees. So then, to let me close here, we can say, to summarize, if low demand and low carbon energy supply work together, we can go to really low carbon building sector, almost or more or less climate neutral. And especially if we use the wood intensive buildings with subsequent cascading, so an additional 30 or 50 years of lifetime in the technosphere of the wood, we can even go to a climate neutral global building sector. But, and now comes the simple but, our model is extremely simple and idealistic because it considers country level average. And at the country level average, you don't see the regional differences. You don't see that in many countries you have huge regional disparities. People move away from some parts of the country and move to the cities. So you have huge stocks that are underutilized in the countryside, but that are not of little use. So what do we do with them in the future is a big question. To study this, we will need to add regional detail to our scenarios. Also, who can afford what type of living and living space? So we need to understand this better, and this, therefore, we need to include the income group detail to the scenarios. We need to come much better also at the regional scale to understand where do we actually have the wood. because wood is a bulky commodity. It's not economic to ship it across the globe, even though it's partly already done, but it makes much more sense to have a more regional circular economy of wood products. And therefore we need to better understand the future wood supply under different climate scenarios. And finally, the low demand scenarios need to be linked to the economic models to understand what does low demand mean for the economy. Will demand shift to service sectors, or is it actually a degrowth scenario? These are extremely policy relevant questions that we would like to tackle in the future or in the discussion. And for now, I would just like to thank you for listening, acknowledge the contributions of the REC team. Some of them are also here in the meeting, and also the Integrated Industrial Ecology Freiburg colleagues. So thank you, and let's have a few clarification questions. So I'm going into the chat. Michelle, that's addressing me, right? Michelle's asking whether I can comment on the carbon sequestering building materials and also about clay or bamboo. And Michelle, the answer is what I showed you here is preliminary work. We only have one material category, which is construction wood. And we would like to differentiate it into especially bamboo, which is very fast growing, but potentially also local, like clay is really important, right? Especially where it's locally available because of its really high recycling potential, but it hasn't been done yet. And it's probably better to start here with small scale case studies, maybe on cities. So we want to have a doctoral student focusing on cities and this resource efficiency scenarios in the future, and not go to the global scale, because when you talk to clay, bamboo, hemp, you really need to think about local supply conditions. Stein, the answer is similar to you. It's this is preliminary work, preliminary results. So the timber cascading is very simply that I assume that a certain fraction of the timber that comes out of the buildings, I don't remember, it's like 70%, gets a second lifetime in like wood panels, particle boards, maybe furniture, and so on for another few decades. So there's no specific application. I just assume that there's going to be demand for it. And that's, of course, needs to be justified. And yeah, the same for Jizao, right? It's very simple. We assume that, let's say 70% of the construction wood end of life gets another 30 years of lifetime in some particle board products. And then I'll move on to Helmut, please.
Yeah, many thanks, Stefan. Great work. And you know that I really admire the kind of structured way in which you approach all this. I have one comment or question. I mean, as we all know, since February this year, we live in a different world, yeah? And we all are used to working with these kind of relatively nice scenarios like SSP1, SSP2, but actually we should be looking at the world divided scenarios that are not as nice as those, yeah? In which many of these materials may become very scarce or difficult to source, or you want to, for geostrategic regions, avoid the import dependencies of moving in this direction. I mean, this is of course not something I expect you to have a real answer to, but I think, I mean, we have to think about how to address these geostrategic challenges in these scenarios, isn't it? I mean, what would be your perspective on that? I think that would be very interesting for me.
Yeah, that's a good point. So first of all, Helmut, I should say that the energy service cascade, right? That's largely building on your work. So I also use it in every course that I teach because it really nicely brings the things together. So we really try to follow this. And I mean, the point is our models are not fit for this, right? Because we have a global aggregated material supply. There is a global industry, but we don't have any trade patterns in this model. And the main reason is the number of trade flows goes with the square of the number of regions. If you have 20 regions, you can have 400 trade relations. And because I'm not comfortable with modeling such a thing from a scenario perspective, we decided we aggregate this. But in the future, and my only point here I could quickly make is we need to link up with economic modelers who have a tradition on, cost supply curves, supply cost curves, which resources are available where at which costs. So they are comfortable in having such trade patterns in their scenarios, also in a much more regionalized world. And a second thing could be the different resources have different strategic value. So let's say copper has a much different geopolitical connotation than has platinum because of its resource concentration, than has maybe waste wood. So it would be good to look into the different materials, primary or secondary, critical or not, and see what are the geopolitical ramifications. Because in the future, I think it will be very material dependent. We see this on the Russia sanctions. It's not that we sanction everything. We really look at where could we hurt the Russian government and what is our own dependency. For example, right now in the EU, we have a discussion on gold. Should we sanction Russian gold flows? So it's really material specific. And I think
this was decided, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's now decided. So no gold from Russia. So I think it will be very resource specific in the future, yes, what the material things will be. So yeah, link up with policymakers and with experts. That would be my comment here, and let's take this up in a general discussion. Very quickly, then I move on to Christoph, to you. Keisuke is asking, what about the policy advice for keeping wood in longer use? We are involved in a project on modular wooden construction. So the idea is to basically have a design for disassembly, building design for disassembly, so that you can have individual beams or floor segments or wall segments and take them out after 50 years and put them into something new instead of destructive recycling. And there's, of course, acceptance problems, and there's also technical problems. How do we know that the joints that we screw together, the wood panels, will still be released, can be released in 50 years or 100 years from now without destroying the wood? So there is the research going on this, but the general idea would be to think more modular, because in the future the buildings will still have floors and walls and columns. So it's a very stable functional pattern, unlike with mobile phones where the functions change, so the computer chips just get outdated. But for buildings, it's not so much the case for structural building material. So thank you again. Let's continue later with the general discussion. Now I would like to introduce, probably known to most of you, Christoph Helbig, now a professor of sustainable resource technology in the University of Bayreuth in Bavaria in Germany. And Christoph will present his work on losses and lifetimes of metals in the economy. We can already see your presentation. The floor is yours, Christoph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for the kind introduction. Yeah, thanks for inviting me as well. Now, this presentation here is about losses and lifetimes of metals in the economy. As Stefan briefly said, this is a work that I have now carried over to the University of Bayreuth, where I started my research group now this February in ecological resource technology. But it is a work that I have done in Augsburg, where many of you probably have seen me in the past, and which is in collaboration with the colleagues from the University of Bordeaux, Guido Sonnemann's group, and in collaboration as well with French Institute BRGM. Let me just, in the beginning, before I get to the paper, briefly mention now this chair for ecological resource technology. What are we exactly doing here in Bayreuth? This is a group about modeling, simulation, and ecological, technical, economic, and social evaluation of global material cycles from mining to recycling. And we use material flow analysis, life cycle assessment, and raw material criticality assessment. So the core methods here of industrial ecology in that research group, and it's hopefully going to grow in the next few years then. But now about this paper. So in May, it was published in Nature Sustainability. That I'm going to present to you now with the method and the results of that paper. It's called Losses and Lifetimes of Metals in the Economy. And the nice thing about this paper is that we actually did this here for 61 metals, the model that I'm going to present to you. which then leads to such neat graphs, so to speak, here in a more simplified version as the one which you will see later on, because this was then edited slightly by nature editors then. What it gives us is a comparison here of end-of-life recycling rates or recycled content with the loss rates that we calculate from our model. And how these loss rates here are going to be calculated, I will show you in the next few slides. What we do essentially is a model about the extraction of ores going through the economy, and at some point these metals are going to be lost at some point. So we want to trace, the model behind that is a matrix model of various models of matrix have already been published. Now this one is called matrix Dissipation, and it's the tracing of a specific material cohort through the economy until it's lost. And we consider here new scrap as well as old scrap recycling and various uses of, as mentioned, 61 metals. To be more precise, how does that work? So we start with 1 kilogram of material, which is extracted, which then is mined, smelted, refined, which then enters a fabrication and manufacturing phase, at which point this can either enter a use phase, or it is a fabrication waste that is collected and then recycled right away, or it's not recycled, then it's another loss. In the use phase, there are various sectors that we look at, 41 in total, because we have so many different metals, so couldn't quite aggregate this to few sectors. So we have 41 sectors as well. And in this use phase, there can be dissipative losses. For some metals, this is not relevant at all. For some metals, it's quite relevant. And at the end of the use phase, we collect these materials, sort it, and then recycle it, hopefully. If not, if the material is not collected, or if the material is not recycled, then once again, this is a loss. And we trace this over decades or centuries in this model as a what-if scenario, just to quantify at the end on a statistical average after how many years the metal is actually being lost. So that means how long is the average lifetime of the metal in the economy. As mentioned, this is for 61 metals, so we basically cover the whole periodic table for metals. There's really just a few which might be interesting to look at in the future. Well, maybe go into sodium or calcium, something like that. But the rest is basically covered. And to make this a little bit more easy to look at, because 61 metals is quite complicated, we split this into 4 different metal groups: ferrous metals, non-ferrous metals, precious metals, and specialty metals. Obviously, specialty metals is still quite a large group. And for time reasons, I will basically only show you now results for ferrous metals and specialty metals. We can quantify 2 different things with this kind of model. The one is here shown on the left side as an aggregate for all ferrous metals in our model. We can quantify at which stage, production, fabrication, manufacturing, use phase, waste management, or recycling, the materials are lost. Here for ferrous metals, you see that this arrow going as a loss to loss stocks from the waste management sector here is the 4th process, is the largest. So most of the ferrous metals are actually lost at some point during the waste management stage. Waste management stage means in this case specifically material collection and sorting. What we can also quantify, and this is shown on the right side, is after how many years after extraction, what kind of what share of the initial 1 kilogram stock is still in use. And there you see here as the one line, for example, for iron, where after about 1 decade, still half that material is in use of the initial 1 kilogram. It's important, this is initial 1 kilogram that is extracted, not initially put into use. So we already start with a loss in the beginning, after 0 years, so to speak. And then even after 2 decades for iron, there's still quite a few of the material left in stock. For other metals, basically everything has already been dissipated. This is the result for ferrous metals. We can also look at this for specialty metals, and they're probably for most of you not very surprising. It's looking a little bit more grim. We see that here now production wastes or production losses are much more important, and that interestingly also here the use phase is quite important, and that the recycling losses, for example, are basically negligible, because for very many specialty metals we don't even get to the recycling stage because the materials are not properly collected or sorted. And overall, therefore, for this group of specialty metals, these average lifetimes are much shorter than what we get for the ferrous metals. These results here are for aggregated metals or metal groups, but we can of course also go into the details here in this model. In the paper, this is shown in the supplementary only, where we look into each of those 61 elements. So we can start in the first year, what kind of the share of the material extracted goes into, in this model, into which sectors are actually relevant, and then look after how many years the share is going into or is still in specific sectors. So all these lines that you see here on the left side, they add up to this total in use stock. And this is shown here for iron. So you can also see after how many years has been what share of the initial stock been lost to within various processes. And we also, on top of that, do a Monte Carlo simulation analysis to quantify the uncertainty of our calculations, depending on the quality of the data that we have for each of the parameters that are relevant, like the production efficiency during mining, smelting and refining, or the recycling rate, etc. And here, just as a comparison, of course, this is really just a selection. Could show you any graph of these metals, of course. Here, these are the results for cobalt as a comparison. Previously, we had iron. Now this is cobalt. You see quite a bit of the material is already used during the production stage because it's not, for example, not separated from a host metal, or simply the processing efficiency is much lower. And then we also see that the applications where the metal is used, like batteries or catalysts, are much shorter living than the applications of iron, predominantly construction sector or vehicles. And therefore, these average lifetimes is much shorter, and we see that the material here is dissipated much earlier. What we can then do is we can quantify these average lifetimes and compare this, including the uncertainty ranges, of course, for all 61 metals here. And we will get to the result that for iron and gold, the average lifetimes are the longest, with about 1 to 2 centuries. But for more than half of the metals that we look at here, the lifetimes are actually shorter than 10 years, which would then, of course, lead to additional demands for primary production over its lifetime, or over the decades into the future. And therefore, we see this as a key figure to quantify the state of the current circular economy for these specialty metals. This then leads us to this periodic table. I showed you in the beginning the simplified version. Here now we can do the calculation and do the comparison as well with both the end-of-life recycling rate and the recycled content, as, for example, nicely drawn as a comparison from the UNEP report about 10 years ago, with some updates a few years ago, or earlier this year, from Tom Gradle's group in Yale, and the recycled content as well. And what we see here is that this loss rate information now includes not only a specific phase. So end-of-life recycling rate, of course, only looks at the waste management and recycling sector. Recycled content can only look at what is currently used in the production and fabrication and manufacturing as secondary material within the production of these products. So both of these do not quantify, for example, or do not take into consideration the longevity and the lifetimes of the products that the material is used in. And this loss rate key figure then puts this all into combination of one specific value. And then you here, once again, you see, for example, that iron and gold come up here in dark blue, being the two metals with the longest lifetimes. Summing up, this is a planetary one-region model for tracing the fate of metals, one metal at a time. So we do not do anything about contamination or mixing of materials. It is an ODEM framework model, available open access in Python as a dynamic material flow analysis model, including all the data that we used for these calculations. So you can actually do this as a rerun, including the scenarios that Stefan and Takuma have nicely presented, so to speak, for any of these 61 metals and any of the 41 sectors that we include. The key results: ferrous metals on average about 1.5 centuries the metals are used. For ferrous metals and precious metals is about half a century, and specialty metals on average, a large group, but on average about 12 years, but half of the metals overall have a lifetime of 10 years or less. And we have this as a comprehensive key figure to quantify the state of the art of the state of the circular economy for a wide range of metals. And this can then be used to evaluate circular economy scenarios or low demand scenarios in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christoph. This was wonderful. I would like to give my applause, but it doesn't show up. It's great to see all this detail and this comprehensiveness, right? And I think it's depressing, the short lifetime of the specialty metals. If you think that the impacts of their production, especially in the mining sector, will last for centuries, maybe millennia, the climate change impact of their production will be there for millennia, and the metal is gone after 10 years. That's not sustainable. So if there are any clarification questions that we should take on the recording, we'll do it now. For example, Jay is asking Jitao, what are the interventions that can reduce the losses?
Yes, so as mentioned, this scenario here and the results shown are only what if everything stays the same as it is right now scenarios. So therefore we also say, well, this is from the year 0 to 200 and not from 2020 to 2220. The intervention that we can take is to improve all of these process parameters. Production yield is especially important for a lot of specialty metals, byproducts, where we see quite low production yields. Of course, there's also effects like there's not exactly as much demand for gallium as we extract during bauxite mining, but that's a different point. We can improve the fabrication yields further. We can increase the lifetimes of specific sectors or the products in those sectors. What frequently comes up for a lot of the materials is that the collection rates of waste, of end-of-life wastes, are too low. And that I see next to the production yields for specialty metals. That is something that I see as something that we consistently find as a result through all of these 61 metals, that the end-of-life collection rates are too small. The recycling rates are, or the recycling yields, to be more precise, then are quite fine for a lot of these metals, but the collection rate beforehand is too small, and therefore this is a big leverage point.
Thank you. And that is an economic/political problem, right? Because it's in the technosphere, so we know where it is. Okay, so I'll now close the recording of the session, but not the session. So all YouTube watchers, thank you for being patient with us, and please connect with our society and our SEM community in the future.